Alright, this is the first video on my channel where I'm actually going to demonstrate how to build some fancy furniture, specifically a record player stand. To begin, you're going to need a woodworking shop, specifically one that's kind of dark and a little bit dingy, that's got sawdust all over the place, some rusty tools and so forth. If your shop is too clean, it just ain't gonna happen. You gotta have a place where you've spent some time and some hours making stuff and making messes and whatever. This project begins in the evening hours. In many parts in Canada, it gets pretty dark. Well, at some points in winter, it gets dark right after 4 p.m. pretty much. It starts to get lighter as spring approaches. So I'm just taking some wood here that grabbed out of the shelf, and I'm going to cut it down to more sizable chunks so I can have a look at it. Of course, whenever you're making your first cuts for whatever it is you're going to build, you always want to cut stuff larger than you need it to be, because there's always going to be things that you're going to need to shave off, or decisions you're going to need to make in terms of doing your finer cuts. And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm looking at the wood, I'm looking at the best arrangements, I look at both sides, look for scuff marks and knots and you name it. And once I come up with a plan, then I usually flip it over and I work from the underside of the wood so I can mark it up and scuff it up without worrying about my final finish. So I'm just marking some cuts for, what do they call those things? Biscuit joiner. There we go. So I've taken this old Mastercraft biscuit joiner, and I'm just running the biscuits in along the lines. Nice thing you can do is when you do have wood laid out like that, you can just follow the same technique, run a ruler, mark your lines, you don't have to measure nothing, and as long as they're consistent, this process will work just fine. So there you go, you can see all the slots that I put into the wood. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab some glue, fill those slots, and grab some biscuits and tap these in. And this process is basically how most woodworkers laminate boards together to make tabletops or for any type of purpose. And you're going to end up with a product that is relatively strong at the end of the day, especially if you can join across the length of the boards like I am doing here. If you can only join in a couple places, then it's going to be weaker, of course. So now what I do is I pinch the whole thing down flat, and then I also pinch it across its length. And what that does by pinching it flat is it will not allow the wood to flex or to bend or to twist under the pressure of the length clamps. So it should be nice and straight and flat by the time you're done. So now you go over it with a sander, and all the glue that may have seeped through, you're going to want to clean that up. And now what I'm doing here is I'm doing my final sizing on it. As I mentioned before, for this kind of process, you want to cut things a little larger than needed, and that way it gives you some space to make decisions on what edges to trim and which edges to keep and so forth. In this case, there were no particularly bad edges, so I chose to trim it more symmetrically so that the join lines would be symmetrically in the middle. It is nice after a long day at work to come to the garage and enjoy the nice cool air and basically build whatever you can imagine. For most of the stuff that I build, I usually don't follow blueprints. I typically have an idea in mind, and I follow a process I call progressive geometry, which means if I know how big I want it to be, generally speaking, if I know how tall I want it to be or how deep or wide, I can basically calculate the rest of the geometry on the fly. I'm sure a lot of woodworkers actually do that. I know some guys are a little more organized and they like to plan the whole thing out in detail. I find if I try to plan it out in detail, I usually forget things anyway, and so I have to end up doing more of the progressive geometry. But I've learned just to stick with that technique. Sometimes you'll get into a little trouble doing that, but if you just try to envision the process as you go through, you're probably going to be all right. So here I'm making the other half of the lid of my record player stand. Now in this case, I'm going to leave a space in the middle, and the goal is that I'll have glass in there, or like acrylic glass anyway. So because of the size of the biscuits and the amount of board that I was able to join, I was only able to put one biscuit in. So in this case, I have a weaker join. So same idea, I have the vertical clamping and I have the length clamping. So there we go, I have both of them together. You can see that the corners line up. So I wanted them, of course, to be the exact same size. So one of the ideas I had as I was considering this project was trying to mimic the square in the portion that I made with MDF in the portion that I made with pine as well. And so the idea was to take a piece of oak plywood, and this is 1/8 inch thick oak plywood, and I was going to cut it to be the exact same size as that other square. And if I could do that, then what I need to do was build an apparatus that would allow me to basically cut out the amount of wood necessary consistently so that I could drop this oak plywood in, and I could have two squares essentially on each surface of the record player stand. And so what I'm doing is I'm using that other one that I built as a template on my pine surface. So then I needed to mimic the exact geometry of what I needed to cut away. So I set up my router with a flush cut router bit, and I put together a couple of just pieces that I can slide around there. So here you can see I have two pieces of MDF 3/4 inch on top of that 1/8 inch plywood, because that's exactly the amount that I want to cut away from my pine. And so I use those slider pieces here and the router, and I'm just looking to cut away the majority of the wood with this process. All the fine tuning and the additional work I'll have to do by hand using chisels. So once I got the majority of it cut away, I mark the rest of the cuts here with a pencil, and then I'm just going to go over that with a razor blade, and I go over this a number of times, enough to get it down, so that way when I run my chisels through, I can hit that cut line and I don't have to worry about damaging the surface of the other wood layer. And this is relaxing work, by the way. Just sit in the shop on a nice day and work away with a set of chisels and a rubber mallet. maybe not the most efficient way of doing something, but it's definitely therapeutic for sure. I did make a mistake when I was doing this. I should have used a little piece of oak plywood and just ran it along all the edges just to make sure that it wasn't sticking up anywhere. And I didn't verify that with just a little piece, and so I actually had to set this in twice, which was somewhat nerve-wracking because I reset it in after the glue dried, because I noticed after it dried in place there was a couple higher ridges. You can't really see it from the camera because they weren't that bad, but it was enough that I thought I should try to reset it, and so that's what I ended up doing. And so that set me back about another day. The other problem with pine is it's a little twisty, and it's really hard to get that to set just right. So there we go. There's the two tops to my record player. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to prep them for routering on the edges, because I want consistent decorative edging around the record player. And I noticed as I did this, I was sanding this down, a little piece of the end of this splintered off. So I took some glue on the end of like something the size of a toothpick, tried to glue that back in, and sand it back flush. And I think that worked out pretty good, actually. So now I'm going to follow the same process with the MDF. I take the same router bit, same depth setting and the whole works, and go around two sides of this tabletop here. So here's the second side, and I don't know if you can see the mistake I made right here. I did not properly support this thing. So this was when this kind of thing happens in your middle of a project, your head starts to spin because you have to calculate what you got to do to fix this. And so what I ended up doing is I took it apart here, and I grabbed a razor blade to shave off the glue, the excess glue, and I sanded it down a little bit, and I tried to get it reset as flush as possible. And one of the problems with working with glue is when it's wet, it's like a lubricant, which means it allows things to slide. And so I set this up really well. I think I measured everything, and it worked out just the way I wanted it to, but I noticed when I took it apart the next day, like I'm showing here, that somehow the jig had slid. Okay, as you saw, the end piece of this table portion busted off when I was rotoring it. I should have known better to support that when I was doing that, but I think I was just in a bit of a rush as I was going through this. So back to gluing it back together. Once that has set, I'll give it another go, and we'll continue where we left off. So now with that little bit of an offset here, I tried to sand that flush as much as possible, but even the finished product, you can see just a tiny little bump left, but that's all right. Sometimes these things just give it a little bit of character. So now once I have the tabletop done, I need to build the frame. And one of the things that I tend to prefer is I like to buy 2x8s or 2x10s, and I like to cut them down myself to what the industry would call a 2x2, right? And so that's essentially what these are. Oh, here's my boy. He's a woodworker in his own right, but he likes to build armor. So he's building some kind of tree armor or something here. I'm not sure what's going on, but got some pretty fancy creations of his own. So here you can see I've got my pile of 2x2s. Now, A lot of people, if they're looking for 2x2s, they could just go to the store and buy a big pack of them. But I've found that the 2x2s at the store are not strong at all. And they're, in my opinion, they're not worthy for any of this kind of stuff. If you look carefully at the store-bought ones, they usually, they're basically chunks of wood that are glued together. And that's just not going to work for what I need. Plus, they're almost always rounded. And so they're actually not that strong, even from a just a rigid perspective. And so if you make your own, if you rip your own 2x2s, they're just going to be stronger and more durable. So here we go. I'm using my table here, my workshop table, workbench, to make sure that all my joins are flush and 90 degrees. And whenever you're ripping 2x2s, you always gotta make sure you have a reasonably straight piece of lumber to do this with. So oftentimes I'm resorting through my lumber quite a bit, trying to find the appropriately straight pieces. Of course, all the music on this is my own music. I think all my woodworking videos have my own music on it at this point, except for there was one song on the sign video that was my father-in-law's recording. That was the last song of that video. Here we go. The local Rugrats are working on their bikes.
Come on. Seriously, what's wrong with you guys? Put your backs into it. Use those muscles. Come on already. Are you serious?
It's always good to razz the kids a little bit. Builds character, right? So here I have a basic box structure for my record player stand. And so then I had to make some decisions on how deep I wanted the drawers to be and the top portion to be. And then I had to figure out basically where all the structural support components were going to be needed. For most of this stuff, I actually used 4-inch screws. Were they 3-inch or 4-inch? I can't remember. Probably 3-inch, actually. 3-inch screws, which might be overkill for some people. But I like to use these large self-drilling kind of carpentry screws for doing this kind of stuff because they just basically weld the glue together. They pinch it so hard. And they don't have any... They don't have as much flex in the joint, between the joints and the wood. And so by the time you're done, you're going to have a product that holds itself together quite firmly. So at this point in the project, I realize I'm going to need some shellac within the next week or so. So I usually like to mix my shellac about a week out. Here I'm just showing you how messy my shop gets as I'm going through these projects. There's a proverb in the scripture that talks about where the stable is clean, there is no oxen, meaning it's impossible to really keep your stable a clean and crisp environment if you're trying to get work done. And that's usually what I find is that sometimes through in the middle of the project, I stop to try to do what I call just kind of rush cleaning, just to more or less make enough table space for me to keep going with the next stage of the project. Although typically between projects, I like to take a break and clean up the whole shop, start to finish. That way I just have a completely clean and organized workspace to begin my next project with. So what I'm doing now is I'm routering some more of these 2x2s and coming up with some designs. I have some really thin pieces of wood here that I know I'm going to need later in the project, because the two lid pieces are going to be offset from each other, because one's going to have a hinge in it. So here you can see some of the routering work, some of the routering design in the wood. Whenever you need to cut 45s, it's a good idea to just double check your blade. I usually don't rely on the measurements provided on the stickers on those machines. I always like to check them myself. So here we go. The shellac is slowly starting to dissolve in the isopropyl alcohol. As you can see, as we get throughout this project, I think I started this in, was it March? Kind of ended it close to end of May, so it's somewhat of a 3-month project. So as we go along here, it actually gets a lot warmer outside and gets lighter out, which is nice. So you can see the record player stand is beginning to take shape. And so one of the things I needed to do, even before I created the drawers and the panels for this thing, is I actually just needed some spacers I could put in this thing so that I knew exactly where I could place or where to mount the additional router 2x2s as decorative bordering around that. So I think that one there is just there as a placeholder. And so I put that all the way around. And so I knew where I could put my decorative border. And that way, if I follow that same measurement later, I can put them back in as drawers. And that also allows me to make sure it is parallel and consistent. I always like to use objects as much as possible for verifying parallels, for verifying measurements and so forth, as opposed to just using a ruler. Because if you can bring things into that tangible world, then you're less likely to make a mistake. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the slats, because I want vertical slats on the sides of this stand, and I want just single pieces of wood to wrap around the top of it. And then I'm going to give each of these slats just a tiny little bit of routering, and so it gives it somewhat of a decorative edge. And it's this kind of stuff, when you get those big knots in the wood like that, it just looks so pretty by the time you're done. You know, the stain and the shellac and the colors, they just bring those big knots and to life. This is what I'm looking at here. And funny thing is, I don't even think I measured to make them exact. I think I was just gonna cut one to be shorter if it needed to be. But as it turned out, that whatever measurement I chose just happened to be perfect, and so I'm not sure how that happened. At this point, I've decided I'm just going to brad nail most of the panels into place. The one drawback with brad nails, of course, is it leaves that little bit of an indent. Now, if a fellow was, really wanted to deal with that, I suppose you could hammer a bigger hole, and then you could put wood filler in there and sand over and gloss that. And if you didn't like that look, you could always try to brad nail from the inside, but you're not going to get as strong a join if you brad nail from the inside out. You always want to go from the outside in, basically. So there we go. That's what the vertical slats look like. So one of the design decisions here was to figure out how to basically bring all the decorative border work and the slats together. And so those pieces were for the front. And I have one more piece here that I'm going to put on the bottom of it. So those pieces went on the front, on the sides there. And this last piece will go along the bottom, and it will bridge the gap there. So for a lot of this kind of work, you really need to visualize it before you get into the process. because you can never go backwards, especially if you're using what I call a progressive geometry technique. Very rarely can you go backwards and redesign or redo something. It's usually a go forward only process, and so you want to visualize everything before you do it as much as possible. So at this point I realized I wanted to build an MDF insert for this thing. I was thinking of all the different ways I could build a shelving insert inside of this, and I realized I wanted MDF for a number of reasons. One is I wanted MDF really binds with paint really well, and I knew I wanted this to be a tri-tone piece of furniture, meaning it has 3 tones to it. So I wanted a paint tone, I wanted a pine texture tone, and I wanted an oak tone. And so knowing that, I realized that I was going to need some laser accurate cuts. So I ended up building myself what they call a cross-cut jig here. And I've seen how it was done. I've watched the odd video on it, so I just attempted it myself. And I was actually surprised how quick and easy it was to build that cross-cut jig. And I've used it quite a bit, and that thing is just amazing. So my biggest concern is that I wouldn't have it perfectly 90 degrees. So I spent quite a bit of time trying to make sure that both the front and back borders on that thing were perfectly 90 degrees to my saw blade. And in order to do that, what I did is I used this yellow square, and I think another one as well, to measure that saw blade against my back borders. And so you really want to take your time on that stuff and nail it down. So I was able to use the crosscut jig to cut all the pieces for my interior frame, and I chose to dowel them together, at least the exterior ones anyways, because dowels are quite strong. So a little bit of dowel, a little bit of glue, and you have a pretty tight join. But even with this, I built just a temporary jig here to hold the 90 degree position on this, and then I put some more clamps on there to really pinch it down hard. So here we go. Here's the finished product on the simple MDF box. And the next steps now are to take a couple pieces of MDF that I cut with, I guess you could say, like laser precision. They just fit in there perfectly. And what I did is I just brad nailed these in with some glue, and that seemed to work pretty good. As far as the shelving panels that are in there, I was concerned about their ability to hold weight, so I actually did pre-drill and run some screws in there. And so now, this is always the litmus test right here. How well did I measure this thing, and can I get it in here? So it's always like you always have a small heart attack when you get to this moment, because you realize, oh boy, if I screwed this up, like, we're done. So let's see, does it work? What the heck? It almost worked. So what I'm doing is I'm sanding the back edges on this thing. And I managed to feed it in a little bit. And it's a bit of a pressure fit. So I use the rubber mallet here, and I work this thing down. Bit of a workout. Okay, this is an example of a tension fit design. Technically, I probably didn't need to do tension fit here, but I didn't want it to rattle around. So by the time I get it in here, it's going to be good and snug. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to finish painting this piece before I sink it all the way in, because once it goes in, there's no coming out. And by having it stick out a little bit, I don't have to worry about the paint getting on the wood, hopefully. And yeah, so that's the goal. So once the paint is done, then I'll finish pressing this in, and then I'll be moving on to staining this piece. One of the other things I realized as I was putting this together is I needed to come up with a game plan on how I was going to build kind of the drawer slides. And I don't like to go out and just buy stuff like metal drawer slides. So here I came up with this idea. Of course, it's not original to me, but basically 2 tracks that could slide on each other. And so I use this design here. You can actually see 3 of them. The middle one's a T track, and the 2 side ones are like upside down L's. And so what this is going to do is, with the drawer in there, you can, if you look carefully now, you'll see the drawer grabs those tracks from the underside. And by doing that, it gives it a very tight grasp on those tracks. So it still slides easy. But it's not going to tilt as you pull it out. It's going to maintain its level, and it's doing that from basically 4 pinch points across those 3 tracks. So the other thing I did here is I took the one side of the lid, I placed it on there as in the best geometrical fashion I could find, and then I just grabbed a pencil, I ran it across the underside, I drew the box. And then I'm putting a bunch of these little 90-degree clamps here, and by pre-drilling them on, I could just rest that on there and it would find its perfect level or perfect alignment. And I'm going to clip it down because with pine, pine always has kind of modulations in the wood. It's always a little bit wavy. So I clamped it down really hard, and I also put some spacers in there. Before I mentioned to you I had those spacers. And then I drilled this in, and so it's not going anywhere. Of course, my concern whenever I'm clamping any wood is that the clamp is going to leave a mark in the wood. So you always want to be careful with that. You don't want to over tension your clamps only to have a great big clamp mark left in your wood. So now I'm taking my MDF and I'm painting it this kind of I don't know what you call that, like a baby blue or kind of like a baby teal blue or something. So yeah, not sure. At this point in the project, it feels good to begin to see the basic geometry. Up until this moment, it just existed only in my mind. And when you get to this point, it gets to be exciting because now you're adding the colors, now you're adding kind of the final flair to it. You're making design decisions and so forth that have an immediate payoff. So I'm picking my colors, I'm mixing some colors here. It's always a little scary to mix colors because the shellac itself kind of works against you a little bit when you're mixing colors, because it has its own color to it, which largely disappears once it dries, but when it's in its liquid form, it has a rather yellowy, orangey color to it. So the challenge with staining, of course, especially in a tritone project, or even just a dual tone project, is you got to make sure whatever you stain the wood, it's going to match the paint really nice. So what I was just doing there with the chisels on that other blue lid is I was just setting it up to set the glass in there. And with shellac, between every layer, you've got to go back over it, you got to sand it down. I like to take a rag and so forth. Okay, so I ran into a bit of a hitch. I don't like the color of the stain in terms of how it works with baby blue. I do like the color of the more natural blonde wood and how it works with the baby blue. That's a great combination. So This is shellac and it's alcohol ink based. My goal now is I'm going to sand it some more, and then I'm going to grab a rag and with some alcohol I'm going to rub this down and see if I can get it back to a lighter tone of grain. And the benefit of doing that is even if I rub the edges, what's going to happen is the darker tone of stain will highlight some of the edging and with some of the router work, and at the same time it will allow some of the natural, or hopefully it will allow some of the natural wood grain to come back. So that's the goal, and we'll see how it goes. So here we go. I got to fix this color problem. That that bright orange. I don't like that color. I rarely like orange or yellow when it comes to wood. So I sanded it down as best as I could, and then I noticed this was still horribly orange. So I'm trying something crazy. I took some blue paint or some blue stain I put together, and I put blue all over this thing. And when it dried, something miraculous happened. It bent the color out of that kind of orangey tone. So it's gotten back to something I can appreciate. So it almost looks like it's in the exact same hue now as the blonde wood. It's just a deeper tone of it. So now I'm taking a different brown, because the last brown I tried was way too orange. This one's called a burro brown, and my hope is that it's not orange or red, it's more along the blue spectrum, and that is exactly what it turned out to be. But I did add a little bit of touch of blue to this anyway, just to be on the safe side. So there you go. You can see the mixing stick there. It has a lighter tone to it. So I go over this again a few more times here. Time to build the inner drawers for this thing. I decided to use MDF, even though it's really thick, just because I had some MDF kicking around and I thought it would make the drawers a little bit artistic. So I came up with a notch and groove design there. Basically glued that together, I don't know if I used brad nails for that, probably not. I think I actually used just regular finishing nails, but I pre-drill them and then I pound them in, and that they hold really well that way. Okay, we're just about done. I'm kind of in the finishing phases now, and I'm just putting on the gloss coats on the project here. I put a satin finish on this yesterday. The satin finishes have a bit of white paint in them, and so it reduces some of the deeper color reflection effect, which I typically don't like that. I didn't actually realize I was putting a satin finish on. I thought I was putting a clear gloss on. So I'm just going to give it a light sanding, and then I'm going to put another high gloss coat layer on. And then I think we're basically done. I just need to mount this and put the handles in. So here we go. So now I'm on the home stretch. I give this thing another gloss coat, which I had to open the doors because it was gassing me out. Lots of fumes on that one. You can see there's kind of a milky surface on these, and that's just because the gloss coat is not dry yet. And whenever you can put a coat on horizontally, definitely do that if you can, because as soon as you go vertical with any type of finishing, the technicality is very difficult because you can so easily get runs. And if you get a run with shellac, sand it and rub it out right away with basically alcohol. If you get a run with like a gloss coat, sand it out, You can even wet sand it if you need to. That often works. So this was the final night of the build. I still needed to build a back plate for it, and there was a couple of things I had to do, and I just called the boys. I said, okay guys, let's get this done. So I get my boy here to help me hold this thing. This is 1/8 inch oak plywood, which I want to run across the back. You got to take your time cutting this stuff because it's so important to get it completely flush. Of course, there's always multiple ways of cutting something on a table saw. You can cut exactly what you need, or you can cut the offset, right? So this next cut I need to do is going to be an offset cut to cut away the excess of what I don't need. Usually when you get to this stage in the project, you kind of get that second win, that extra bit of energy to say, all right, we're in the finishing zone and the end zone. And so you just want to go for it. So there we go. I got the right dimensions. But of course I don't want it just to be dry oak because that will clash with the rest of the design. So I have a little bit of the darker shellac left over. It was actually just barely enough to cover this, and I put that in, and here we go, guys. This is what the finished product looks like. So it turned out very nice. And of course, if you've ever seen a proper shellac finish, especially a multi-layer shellac finish, it does such neat things with the light, which is why almost from every different camera angle, when you look at this product, it just looks a little different. So here we go. This is where the record player stays in, and I just put down some kind of soft kind of, I don't know what you call that, like rubber or something, so the lid can sit on that. Turned out pretty nice. And those drawers fit in there just perfectly as well. Again, in this case, the drawer holds its self-stable very well, and these will not be used as much, I'm sure, but they're just they just slide in and out there. No tracks necessary for those. And there you go. That's how to build your very own record player stand.